Belal versus Garry. Belal. Am I saying that right? Belal. Belal Muhammad. Belal taking on Ian Garry. Interesting match. I got to tell you, this entire card from Qatar is the best non-pay-per-view I've ever seen. It is surprising. My head turned and my jaw dropped when I read about this card. I then had an argument. I cover all pay-per-views. So I'm assuming that I'm going to go to Bristol to cover this, and they're going, nah, we don't need you. I'm thinking, why aren't you using me? What do you mean? They said it's not a pay-per-view. And I argued. So of course this is a pay-per-view. And there was even a rumor at one point that Umar versus Oliveira was on this card. They ended up getting moved. I know you've already seen that fight, but there was a rumor that it was on this card. That's how loaded this Qatar card was. And when I look at Belal and Garry specifically, here's my problem, okay? There is talk and discussion around this that if Ian Garry wins, Ian Garry could be next for Islam and fight for the world title. My problem is that the talk and the narrative has been exclusively that. And I had this conversation directly with John Anik. And John agreed with me. But what I said, John, I understand in this sport, fair, the right thing to do. Like, that's not necessarily part of it. There is some fanfare. It's a business. There's other things that we have to look at for decision making. I do understand that. But if I'm an influencer, and I am, I don't conceptually like the idea of saying with a great performance, Ian Garry can fight for the title. And I'll tell you why. It's not because I don't think with a great performance, Ian should fight for the title. I don't like the narrative of it, and I'll tell you why. If we're going to do that narrative going into a fight, going into a main event, going into Qatar, we're going to do it because Ian Garry's got a great record, he's competed well, and he's coming up the ranks. Okay, great. None of those things trump former world champion. So if Garry is going into a match that has a possible outcome of world title ramifications, then Belal has to be going into that same match. If we're going to call it a number one contenders match, I'm in. If we're going to call it a possible number one contenders match, I'm in. Because both of those terms are now equal for both guys. That's not the narrative. The narrative has been extremely specific. And it is just for Garry. But Belal's going into the same thing. He's going to the same country. He's making that same flight. He's doing the same training camp. He's cutting the same weight. He's taking on the same risk. Oh, and by the way, his resume as former world champion is better. So, what does happen? What does happen here? Now, my hypocrisy knows no bounds. I do understand an opinion that I'll have this morning. I may not apply that same opinion to a different fighter, different athlete later in the afternoon. And that's kind of what I was admitting to John. Like, look, I do know there's some circumstances in the sport, and we all do follow them. But one thing about it, and I don't know where this still stands, but one thing about it is Belal and Islam were not going to compete. And just to remind you, when Islam was the 155-pound champion and he was discussing going up to 170 pounds, he was very clear to say, let me see Belal and Jack fight. Wait till that's over. Because I'm only going up if Jack wins. Which, that's the way it was worded. But what that meant was, I am not going to come up and challenge Belal. They had a relationship and they trained together and that kind of formed a bond, and Islam They weren't quite teammates, but they were close. And Islam said, I'm not going to do that. So I don't know if that deal still stands. I don't know. To my understanding, Belal has not changed his mind that his goal and everything he's doing is to drive him in a direction of becoming world champion. My understanding is, just because now happens to be Islam, that Islam's the one that came to the weight class. So for Belal to continue on his pursuit of trying to be number one, even if it involves going through Islam, my understanding is that doesn't break the deal, but I haven't been totally clear on that. And the reason I say that from a world of hypocrisy standpoint is, if the reason that we're not making this a number one contenders match straight up, if what's good for Garry is not good for Belal, but that's based on the idea because Belal doesn't want the Islam fight, then I have to rethink my position. But I haven't heard that. I think that Belal does want the title fight, which now happens to be against Islam. I know that Garry is going to do everything he can to steal that fight. And Garry, with a good performance and one shot on a microphone, can cover more ground than an other fighter having a year's worth of victories couldn't do. I believe Kamaru Usman is the guy for Islam. I believe it's just, as a fan, that's the match I would like to see. That's the match that will show us what Islam can do standing up. Because he is not going to just get on top of Usman. I also think that Islam standing up is probably better than we give him credit for. But this would be his chance to show that. I think that's a very fascinating match, particularly in the absence of Rakhmonov. So it's Garry versus Kamaru. I see that, and that fight is going to take place in the media. And I don't want Kamaru to sit this one out. Kamaru Usman, as a sportsman, as a gentleman, oftentimes sits these things out. And I don't want him to do that. I want him to jump in this fight. He needs to understand Garry is coming for him. Gary's coming for his spot. And he's going to do it through words. He's going to do it through a microphone. He's going to do it by getting the mandate of the masses, not by actual head-to-head competition. Garry is not going to call for a fight with Kamaru Usman. Gary's going to call for a fight that Kamaru Usman wants. It's a different fight, but it's a fight nonetheless. I promise you, Gary's going to play. And Gary's going to win if Kamaru essentially concedes. Kamaru Usman needs to step forward and be ready for this battle.